It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Dr. Yunas Ahmad. Many of you are probably familiar with Professor Ahmad's contribution to scholarship already, so I won't sort of go into a detailed introduction. But I do want to point out the fact that Professor Ahmad has an extensive career in the academy. Before coming to LUMS a few years ago, he taught at Bradford University, at Warwick, and at Oxford as well. Besides his contribution to scholarship, besides teaching, he was involved and had senior administrative posts and responsibilities in these different universities. Professor Ahmad is one of the leading political scientists actively working in the country at this point in time. He's an expert on South Asia. His research and scholarship has touched upon nationalism, ethnic studies, and international politics. I enjoyed the paper very much, and I'm looking forward to the presentation on the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Over to you.
I'm going to talk about CPEC, and I want to frame it in global politics to get a better understanding about what is actually CPEC and what are the implications about CPEC, cutting through some of these narratives that we keep hearing, that it's all win-win and life is going to be rosy and wonderful and whatever. And so, very simply, I'm going to say something about theory. And I'm not going to talk about theory because I want to sort of, I can spend, there is a very interesting discussion in theory, but I don't want to sort of bamboozle you about theory. What I want to do is to use it as a way of understanding the political relations which are developing, and as it gives us some insight. It gives us some insight and some explanatory capacity. And so from there, I'll say a few words about CPEC. I'm not going to spend a lot of time about the details, but there are some conceptual issues which need to be clarified about CPEC, and then start framing CPEC on the regional level, particularly South Asia, then say a few words about China's understanding about what they think BRI and CPEC is in their interest, and then bring it up to the global level and look at US-China competition, and then come back and saying, well, if the world is like this, and this is what's the debate is going on the broader scale, then, you know, what are the implications of CPEC? What are the potentials of CPEC and its pitfalls in that kind of framework? So that's the kind of overview. And I just say something about the theoretical side. I mean, the thing is, at the moment, there's this fad in Islamabad, everybody's talking about geoeconomics, like suddenly they discovered it. But the point is that every IR theory has geoeconomics in it. Whether you talk about realism, where they talk about it as a hard power, that you can use economics to coerce your opposing states, or whether you talk at the other end of the spectrum about globalization, where you're saying the state is dead because it's so economically entangled, it can't do anything coercively because of the interrelationship. But geoeconomics is fundamentally part of IR theory, and it is about a mix. It's not just geoeconomics, it is geopolitics. It's the two combined together. And this is why I use a regionalism framework coming from Buzon and et al., that he said if you want to understand politics on a global level, you need to move away from the global, which might have been pertinent during the Cold War, which is less pertinent in the post-Cold War world, to the region, because this is where all the action actually takes place. And so what he's trying to say is that actual global politics intervenes through the region. It doesn't just drop in from space. It actually has to find local actors and then use local actors to intervene. And so you need to understand the regional landscape. And so the question then becomes is that, China has aspirations to rise, what you call as a global power. The question is that to do that, first it has to become dominant in Asia. It has to dominate the region before it can actually have a global aspiration. But the only problem about Asia is that there are already many great powers. The United States is sitting in Asia in various strategic locations. Japan is already a great power. And India is a rising power. And so the idea that, China can become dominant in Asia as a stepping platform to becoming a global power is not that straightforward. There are many, many rivals which are out there. And I think this raises the kind of polarity of positions. Is there a peaceful rise? Is there a pathway to peaceful rise? Or are we talking about, at the other end of the spectrum, Thucydides' trap, that we are going to talk about some kind of skirmishing between the United States and China, which will escalate and become a major conflict. And in that conflict, China will probably be the loser given the power-weight ratio of military strength the United States has. But it's not black and white. There are intermediate points. And I think what I'm trying to look at is that this is an attempt by China to find a pathway which is minimally conflictual. I say minimally because there's no pathway which is without any kind of conflict. And so I think this is the kind of dilemma which I kind of frame this. When I start talking about BRI and talking about CPEC, this is the kind of framework that we're kind of putting it into. So this is the kind of way we kind of frame it. The question is, okay, we're saying, well, is CPEC BRI something to do with a peaceful rise? What is CPEC? Well, let's say something about CPEC. I think for context, one, it came at a moment, or after rather the moment, when the Kerry-Lugar system package collapsed. It was Lettergate. There was no money coming in from the United States. And here, at that moment, the Chinese came along and said, "Oh, we have this project called BRI. We want to invest in Pakistan." And the political leaders said, "Oh, wonderful, manna from heaven. This is great." There was a complete dearth which was taking at that point, and I think that's one of the kind of important motivations which was behind the government, whether it was mainly Nawaz Sharif when this thing developed. So we have this kind of narrative which has been spun out both by Beijing and by Islamabad. Oh, this is a win-win relationship. And the Chinese argument basically is that, our experience of industrialization is that if you don't create these connectivity, resolve the connectivity problem that you have within the economy, you cannot industrialize. And so, when we talk about CPEC projects, it's all about this idea that's about connectivity. It's about a strategy which has been tried and tested in China and has been successful there. And this is how we can use it. Islamabad's variation on that is, yes, this is a route to industrialization. We can hitch on to the China Express. We can, which become an export or manufacturing hub. We can create a connectivity network which will reach out into Central Asia. So these are the kind of win-win kind of narratives which are being, what you call, spun out. There was a moment when this idea was being, what you call, expressed by the Chinese. Pakistan was very useful to them at that point. It was useful in that sense that here was a country where they have quite close relations. They understand each other. Certainly the Chinese understand where power is in Pakistan, who to talk to when things go wrong, and that they can actually push through this model of development, and they can use that as a template to sell it elsewhere. Because when they were talking about what they call Central Asia, they have to talk to Kazakhstan, to Uzbekistan, to Kyrgyzstan, and all these countries are rivalries among themselves, don't trust the Chinese, have the Russians looking over their backs at the same time saying, "What are you doing here? This is my backyard." And so the idea of building a simple, what you call connectivity route running all the way through Central Asia to Europe was actually mired in bureaucratic wrangling, technicalities, and lots of issues. And Pakistan was simple. One country, who we know, and we can push through a certain thing and we can do it quickly. And so there was that side to it. And so we come to these various projects we came with CPEC. But we need to be clear, what is CPEC, by the way? Because everything to do with China is not necessarily CPEC. We have a whole series of bilateral relations, whether it's dams, whether it's nuclear reactors, whether it's military aircraft, whether it is various other kinds of projects that are bilateral, have nothing to do with CPEC. And then we had projects like Gwadar, which started outside of CPEC, outside of the Chinese. It was first started off by a Singaporean company and then transferred and became part of CPEC. And so, the idea of what is CPEC is kind of a bit fluid. And then what actually makes it even more complicated is that public spending, there is public PSDP money also being put in, and this is CPEC project. So Pakistan is financing a whole number of particularly connectivity projects itself and calls it CPEC. And so actually there is a certain, the Chinese are very clear. CPEC is loans. CPEC is loans which they charge around about 4%. These are commercial loans. And you can also see that if you want to understand what the Chinese think about CPEC, it is those things which they are funding directly through private banks and etc. So you have to actually think a little bit carefully about that dimension. And I think, as an example, for instance, there are some monies going to Gwadar which were grants. And that was the only place where they gave grants. And precisely because they couldn't give commercial loans and make anything out of it. And so they just gave grants in small cases. What are the, I'm not going to go through the detail of every single motorway which has been put under CPEC. I'm sure you have a pretty shrewd idea. But we have Gwadar as a port and as a processing zone, industrial processing zone. We have a whole series of power plants ranging from what you call solar all the way to gas through to what you call coal. So we have power plants. We have a whole range of motorways, extensions, and connectivity projects. And then they're now talking about SEZs, special industrial economic zones. And they're talking about land, agricultural land being brought into CPEC, and they're also talking as something upstream. So, there's enough in that to sort of disappear. But here's a map. I think the map kind of illustrates what you call the projects, the scales, and etc. I'm simply going to say a few general comments about this because some of these issues I'm going to come back to when I start framing the context better. One is the lack of transparency in the decision-making process. All these things happened between what you call at governmental levels without public debate, without going to parliament, without going to public input. And so there is a whole question mark about why these projects are being what you call promoted, why are these why these sites have been selected, is it the best way to take these loans and etc. So closely tied to that is actually agency. And that is that the site selection of particular projects are in the hands of the Pakistani authorities. They made very specific decisions to prioritize certain projects themselves, and they have their own consequences as well, given that this is all taken behind closed doors and nobody knows what's going on, and so they make these kind of calculations. And so one of the things that, so what I would first point out is that, go back to Gwadar. Well, I mean, you know, Gwadar, I mean, is now being sold as an industrial zone, entrepreneur, connectivity hub, and etc. The only reason that Musharraf actually put Gwadar there was they wanted a military base, a naval base outside the reach of the Indian Navy, and it was entirely a security-driven driver in this. And every subsequent government since then has been trying to figure out how we can actually make this viable. The initial decision is about security. It's not a decision about economics. And so, you know, and when we talk about power plants, you know, I mean, you know, now we realize, you know, I mean, the cost, given that, you know, we went from a model of importing energy, which now we realize is unsustainable. At that time, the decision was very political. The decision was that we want to be able to go to the next election and say that we have solved the power problem by building all these what you call power plants, and voila, please vote for me. It didn't quite work out like that, but that was the attitude. It was a political decision. And we know that, you know, that if they had said, no, we are going to deal with the problem of IPP, guaranteing what you call energy, we are guaranteeing that we will pick up X amount of energy whether we need it or not. The transmission loss issue, the issue of inefficiency and non-payment to distributors. If you had dealt with that, you might have actually had a much more manageable problem when you come to the what you call this rolling debt that we have to do with subsidizing energy costs. What I'm trying to point out is that, you know, the decision making that took place is not entirely economics. And so when you start looking at these projects, that we have an issue about other reasons that are what you call taking place behind the scenes. I think finally the other problem was that at the time when they started, it was when they first went to the IMF, CPEC was 10% of the entire debt Pakistan owed. Now it's grown to 20%. But the point is, it is commercial loans. It is commercial loans. It is part of, there is a debt servicing demand that you are willy-nilly taking money without really thinking about how you're going to pay it off. And I think I'll come back to that and say that again, but fundamentally, in the back of politicians' heads, and probably in the military as well, is that they don't believe it's a loan. They think it's just some kind of aid or something like that. I think it's deeply set in that sense. One of the more, what you call, hostile criticisms of CPEC came from our neighbor, India. I think actually that there is a public kind of space, or the public intellectual is highly critical. Government actually is a bit more ambivalent, because AIIB, which is forgotten the meaning, but one of the major funding, multilateral funding agencies set up by the Chinese to fund BRI projects, is the Indian government has a number of projects, applications pending with them. And so they're quite happy to take money from the Chinese when it suits them. The only point is they don't like it when it doesn't suit them. And so when we talk about what the media and the think tanks are saying, is the two arguments are a string of pearls and debt trap diplomacy. The string of pearls basically is they say, oh, you take Gwadar, you take Hambuta, you take what you call Burma, you add Djibouti, and you will be able to change the geopolitics of the region. Well, actually, I mean, the Chinese themselves said, yeah, string of pearls, more like string of sitting ducks. Without a deep water navy to protect it, these places hardly can actually provide the kind of geostrategic or geopolitical kind of claims which New Delhi is making. So one argument, one of the fundamental things, of course, is that one perceptive Indian academic pointed out is that India sees the Indian Ocean after the vacation by the United States of Deir Garcia as India's ocean. And so the idea that Chinese walked into their backyard and start building bases was a bit of a rude shock to them. They thought, this is ours, these people are going to go, and we will do what we want. And so they've been a bit upset in that sense. The other angle, of course, is that any investment in China, whether it's in Kashmir, which they say is disputed, which they claim, or means that in any future conflict, it draws China into that conflict. And so there is no longer a straightforward fight between Pakistan and India, but also brings China into that thing. The other argument that they use is, oh, this is all about debt trap diplomacy. But I mean, and they were very vociferous, particularly when Sri Lanka went bankrupt, and etc. And they were asking, oh, yeah, but I mean, 80% of our loans are to Western organizations. If you want to talk about debt trap diplomacy, that's a better example rather than the 20% the Chinese give. But I think this is all about India's own great power ambition. This is about India's ambitions itself, that it sees the Indian Ocean as its own sphere of influence. It wants to, protect its markets, particularly in Southeast Asia. It's developed a policy called Act East, so that it intervenes, with a whole range, a number of Southeastern countries, bilaterally, multilaterally, both economically as well as strategically. It sees itself as a player in East Asia, and even though it didn't sign up to RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Pact, which the Chinese floated as a free trade zone, it didn't do that. It's still very much engaged with the region. And the other area, which they call Look North, which is still quite important, but not as important actually, is that they have traditionally an influence in Central Asia, going back to the Soviet period, a cultural and economic influence, which they saw as their sphere of influence. And with BRI and the Chinese arriving, they seen themselves being squeezed out of that. And they have their own plans. And I mean, they become frustrated that Pakistan doesn't budge on trying to improve relations. And so they would think, well, we'll just bypass Pakistan. We build Bandar Abbas in Iran. We'll turn that into a connecting route. It'll open up Afghanistan, go to Central Asia. They have a plan called Connect North, which will be run all the way through Iran into Russia. They want to pipe natural gas from Central Asia to Bandar Abbas and then just ship it straight to Bombay or wherever they need it. And so they had their own ambitions, both in the Indian Ocean, in Southeast Asia, and in Central Asia. And this is a rude interruption to their own, ambitions in that sense. So if you want to understand their motivation, you're seeing that, they make certain claims, and the question is, the Chinese don't actually see them to be serious contenders in that arena. So, okay, I'll say something about BRI and China. So what is BRI? There's no master plan. There isn't a document that says this is BRI. Like there isn't a document where it says CPEC, basically. There isn't a master plan. This is Xi's personal baby. And it's probably something which was pragmatic for him to do a particular thing at a particular moment. How much is it? God knows. Because the reason why I say God, no, they claim up to $4 trillion is a figure floated around. But when people start looking at the money, they don't know how many times something has been double accounted for, whether projects which were pre-BRI have been rolled into BRI. A lot of investment in Africa took place earlier, but it's been put into BRI. BRI is this great umbrella where everything the Chinese do outside of China has been put into. Yeah, it is big though. Let's be clear about it. It's big, but how big we don't know. So what is the motivation? So one motivation is geoeconomics, going back to theory and going back, because it is geoeconomics and geopolitics together. And the geoeconomics is, it's a financial stimulus package. When it was introduced, it was designed explicitly to reinflate the Chinese economy, which wasn't growing very fast at that particular moment. And it was very targeted at the same time. It was targeted at those industries where there was overcapacity: steel, construction, cement, coal, all of those dirty industries which they in their 2030 plan want to phase out and move upstream into high technology. They want to create a space for these industries to carry on producing by giving an opportunity to be exporting. You could have said, well, why couldn't they just sort of ask them to do more internally? Well, that would have caused inflation. So this was a way of exporting a financial package designed to support specific industries and then putting them outside. Tied to it is development of Central and Western China. I mean, these are less developed regions. I mean, these are regions where their per capita is half of that on the East Coast. These are regions where there are restive minorities. These are regions where Han Chinese are not so dominant. And so the idea of development is also to do with an assimilation strategy of bringing development, allowing Han Chinese to move there. I mean, 40%, I mean, we talk about Uyghurs. I mean, if you look at Xinjiang, I mean, 8 million Uyghurs, there's already 6 million Han Chinese there, plus all sorts of other minorities and etc. Within a decade or so of this kind of development, they will become a tiny minority and an irritant to the grand schemes that the Chinese want to do. The other thing is, of course, it's geopolitical. If we talk about the United States saying pivot to Asia, and I'll say more about pivot to Asia, this is China's response. BRI is also pivot to Asia. It's pivot to Central Asia in that sense. And I will show you a map in a minute, but I mean, you know, it is breaking the C-shaped encirclement of China. If you look at the map and saying, where are all the military bases? There is a big sea going through a C shape, going through the Pacific Rim, into the Indian Ocean, into into the Gulf of military bases. And where there are no bases, Central Asia. Where there are where there were, just after the Iraq War, but they were all pushed out. So they are breaking that encirclement. They are getting direct access to Europe, which cannot be cut off by the Malacca state. And so there are choke points in the sea routes, which they can bypass. They are securing directly energy, gas, petroleum, mineral resources, particularly from Central Asia directly, which cannot be cut off, because all these are vulnerabilities to the Chinese economy. They have to import energy. They have to import mineral resources. All of this can be choked off. And ultimately, this can be seen as the Asianization of globalization. It's pushing globalization further into the Asian mainland and helping China to become dominant. And so if you look at the map and you see the routes, you know, you can see most of the routes are going outwards. And if you look at this map here, where all these flags are, these are the military bases. And you can see that where there is the space is precisely in those areas where the American military and American presence is nominal. It's moving, it's diffusing into spaces where the West is weak. And so when they talk about, CPEC plus or whatever, BRI, they talk about Central Asian states and that now increasing Russia in Iran. This is all areas where the United States has minimal influence. And so geopolitically, it's moving into that area because this is all about the United States. I mean, if one thing that Chinese policymakers are obsessed about, it's not about what's India doing or Pakistan doing or what's happening in Asia, it's the United States. And the United States saying that they are competitors. We are competitors with China. They don't say they're adversaries. Adversaries have to be destroyed at all cost, at all price. They don't say that. This is a response to the pivot to Asia, and on one level, it's geostrategic. And so when you saw that all the military bases in the Pacific Rim, now they're kind of boosting it up with an Indo-Pacific strategy, where India is now becoming part of what you call this coalition, loose coalition, whether it's the Quad or whether it is AUKUS. The idea is to beef up what you call geostrategically on those sea routes to encircle China. I mean, the Malacca Straits are basically here, and that's where the choke point for the Chinese economy lies. If they block that, Chinese goods cannot go, energy cannot come in, they can actually strangle the Chinese economies. And so on one hand, they have beefed up the geostrategic strategy. India is being brought in as a way to balance China. And increasingly, they're beginning to think, hang on a minute, we need to do something in terms of economics. They revived the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but now they're talking about build better framework, the Japan-Africa corridor, and etc. And all I will simply say is that these things are already behind the curve in comparison to what Chinese have done. RCP is already in action, is a free trade zone between China and the Pacific countries. BRI is not on the planning stage, it is at the maturing stage in all series different countries. I mean, critics about Build Better Framework, which is the global version of Build Better America, is saying, well, Build Better America has hardly been a success in itself. How do you export something which hasn't worked so well at home? And things like Japan-Africa corridor has been going on, but nobody has done something in that sense. And so what's happening is they're trying to put some geoeconomics in, but to catch up with the Chinese. But the main focus up to now has been geostrategic. Okay, do I need to say something else about that before I talk about Pakistan? Yeah, I mean, it's behind the curve. It's behind the curve in one sense, and at the same time, it's highly focused on conflict rather than trying to change the economic landscape. And so there are two different strategies at play. The Chinese want to change the economic landscape and turn China into a gravity well where all the economies revolve around in Asia. And the Americans are trying to create a geostrategic framework and trying to draw the Pacific Rim into some kind of loose alliance. And the problem what they're finding is that when they go to their partners, whether they are in the Pacific or whether even the Indians for that matter, and they said, they talk about security, they say, yeah, we agree with you. They say, okay, but when it comes to cash, they're talking to the Chinese. When it's to finance, they're talking to the Chinese because that's where the money is coming from. Nobody is prepared to say, we don't want Chinese money. And so the Chinese have been successful in creating that ambivalence. So where does it leave Pakistan then? Well, I think the question about peaceful rise or conflict is what you call quite important, really. I mean, I don't think conflict is that clear-cut at the moment because economic entanglement is so much between the two countries that if they decide to go into conflict mode, they will hurt their economy, both of their economies simultaneously in different ways. I mean, Americans are sanctioning, they did sanctions, Chinese countered with sanctions. The Americans, selective sanctions, by the way. Both are using selective sanctions. They don't want to damage the relationship so much because both of them need each other for economic reasons. And so there is a great degree of entanglement. As I said, the main purpose of CPEC and BRI is that it's a financial package to stimulate the Chinese economy. And what's happening now is that, and yes, it's also a backdoor for China, that if things really get worse in the future and that we move away from being competitors to being real aggressors, they now have a framework which they can transform into a geostrategic alliance. The structure is in place. I mean, there's no point having an alliance if you cannot move, you don't have the roads, the connectivities, the ports to move your military assets, etc. But also they're getting cool on BRI because with the economic shockwave coming out the Ukraine war and the price or energy increase and etc., it's not just Pakistan. I mean, a lot of countries are struggling with the debt, which the Chinese have have been responsible for. And so they're now thinking more and more about being selective and much more about viability. And I think I didn't say one thing was that there has been a study looking at Chinese lending practice, and most of in nearly all the samples they did, and there's no reason to say that CPEC is any different, is that the money they lend is linked to claims on the assets. So if they build a port, they have a claim on that port. If they build a road, they have a claim on the road. The fact that they haven't done it in any case is because is for other reasons. I mean, the problems is that rather than if they make any concession in one case, they will have to make concessions across the board to all the other people that they have lent money to. So rather than making that kind of concession, they just simply re-roll the debt. In these cases, but as I said, they're now beginning to have second thoughts about this. What is the CPEC narrative? Oh yeah, silver bullet to industrialization. Sorry, investment is very, very small when you actually compare it to the total, size of the Pakistan economy. It becomes about 2-3%, and this was a study done by McCartney when the money was coming in, and now, of course, it stopped, so it is even shrunk in that sense. Is it going to, create industrialization? Hardly. As I said, the investment is small. There's already a slowdown in China. So the idea that there will be further investments coming from China become much more difficult. And if we look at SEZs from the idea which originally were about being export processing zone, they are now saying, well, actually, this is for the domestic market. And so rather than changing anything, this is just simply going to reinforce various kinds of issues which are already existent in the economy. Does it make independent from the West? Not really. Our main markets, export markets, are the US and Europe. I mean, the amount of levers that the United States has of Pakistan are considerable. I mean, the cultural input. Who speaks? There's only one person who can speak Chinese in this room, and we're also English speakers, This is just a significance of the cultural impact of the West. We are orientated to Washington and London. We're not orientated to Beijing. And on top of that, they have financial and economic, through the World Bank, the IMF, and also economic implements, they can sanction Pakistan. So the idea that we can suddenly drift off and forget about and say goodbye to the West is forget it. And I think this whole economic crisis shows how tied we are. We have to go begging to the IMF, please help us, we are in dire states. And so the idea, that about CPEC, or the other idea is, this is the great connectivity network and we are going to open up Central Asia. I'll just say, Gwadar is never going to be Shenzhen. Let's be clear about it. Shenzhen was next door to Hong Kong. It was next door to Hong Kong, and Chinese investors in Hong Kong put money into Shenzhen, and then international investors say, we can make a buck too. You put something far away, remote, still can't get to Gwadar directly from Islamabad or Lahore. You have to go to Karachi and then go to Gwadar. The idea that this is going to become like Shenzhen is really remote. There isn't that kind of motivation. You create something for security reasons, and now you want to make money out of it. It's not that straightforward. And the other argument about connective opening up Central Asia and etc. We just don't have the economic pull. The Pakistan government has some problem about paying bills. Chinese are upset we don't pay off even the money we owe to them. We don't have the money to what you call do fundamental trade. How do you think we are going to attract economic activity from Central Asia? With what? They're not going to take rupees. They want hard currency. And there is a fundamental, so I sort of, the metaphor I use is like building a row of carriages, but we don't have an engine. There's no economic engine to pull it anywhere. And I think the other thing, of course, is, do we really want to be in a collection of authoritarian states, of Central Asia, of Iran and Russia? Do we want to be sitting in their alliance? After all, you may not get a choice if the United States gets annoyed with you, but I don't think that is a very attractive proposition. And the idea that we want to, jump into bed with all of these people without thinking too much about it, I think you need to be a little bit cautious there. And that there are serious consequences, because you will get straight away sucked into US-Chinese rivalry at that point. And so what I'm saying is, you got to be ambivalent. So Pakistan policy needs to be ambivalent here. If you're going to talk about policy, don't jump to bed with anybody or jump into bed with everybody. Be very promiscuous in that sense. And so really, it's about balancing US and China. So it's like Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, they take Chinese investment, and they will say to the United States, yes, we agree with you on the South China Sea. They're not going to say no to Chinese money, but they are playing both off. They are working between them. You can see this happening. The idea that the Saudis are building the refinery, and Barrick is now saying, well, we can use Gwadar to export ore and things. That is the kind of diversification you really want. But if you really want an economic engine, you're going to have to talk about New Delhi. Some years ago, the trouble is that New Delhi is moving on. But some years back, we had a guy from an Indian think tank, and he was saying, you need a big ticket item to make India change its attitude to doing trade with Pakistan and opening up the economy. And a big ticket item was something like the Turkmenistan gas pipeline. We're talking about multi-billion-dollar kind of thing. The trouble is, if you wait too long, they'll build a pipeline somewhere else, some other route, and it will become redundant. But, the Indian economy has the capacity to pull trade from Central Asia, and Pakistan would benefit from that. It would also get America off your back. Because then you are playing, because America, while on one hand wants to use India and therefore will tolerate it, if you have improved relations with India, it makes it more difficult for the Americans to simply target you, etc. You got some cover in that sense. There is of course the potential to broker better relations between India and China. One thing is interesting about the standoff which took place in Galwan and etc. Noted by an American. They said that the mere fact that the Chinese and the Indians were facing each other meant that India actually postponed its development of the Navy, which the Americans wanted. And the Indians are now very concerned that they're going to end up with a two-war front. And so there is a real interest on their part to say, well, maybe we should, do something different. Mind you, I know there are backdoor channels, but I mean, be realistic. I mean, the chance of anything this is happening is low, but I think I need to say it, that there is no solution. There is a solution, except people don't want to accept it, and that's a different problem. So I'll just wrap up now. Last night, look, I mean, these are loans, and if they are loans, you're going to have to pay for it. You know, it's right. But the Pakistan attitude is that we max one credit card and then get another credit card and transfer the debt to that, and so this is unsustainable. I mean, one of the things that I should have mentioned was that when people talk about CPEC as the grand project, they talk about the individual projects, connectivity, Gwada, power plants, and that they have synergy because they provide support to their various functions, and then CPEC connects up with BRI, and there will be a synergy bonus. Well, I don't see that at all, actually. I actually see that quite a few of these projects are going to struggle. There is a viability issue, and the simple is because they weren't actually made by economic decision making. There were other decisions ensured in that. If you are doing things for political or for security reasons, right, then the question is, how you're not going to get the best terms from whoever you're doing business with. And I think some of the projects will actually exacerbate Pakistan's problem. The power sector is precisely an example of that. We said, what's our problem? We don't have energy. Well, actually, it wasn't that. We thought we just built more power plants and we can ignore the difficult problems about why we don't have a better power production and distribution system. And we thought we'll just build more power plants dependent on external energy sources. And the moment the world market changes, we are in a great difficulty. It just made our problem worse, not better. And so some of our problems, some of the issues about CPEC are not about actually CPEC. They're about the Pakistan's economy. I mean, one of the things was, we're going to use this and become export-orientated, and we will export processing zones and so. Well, we don't have an export economy. We have an import economy. You need to restructure the economy if you want to talk about an export economy. But anyway, finally, I would just want to say is that you need to balance US and China. This is not a case of jumping to bed with one person because the price will be very high. And the question is, you need to be ambivalent. You need to play people off. You need to satisfy each side and get what you want. But you need to thinking about what's important for. And I hate to use the word national interest as opposed to personal political interest. I think there is a different level where this operates. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samad. That was, I sort of really enjoyed the presentation, and I really enjoyed reading the paper as well. And I think what you've given us through the paper and the presentation is a very good, broad overview of how to think about CPEC, both from the perspective of Pakistan and a South Asian perspective, and then finally a larger regional perspective, which includes a key non-Asian power, which is the United States. Non-Asian in the geographic sense, although since the 19th century, as students of history will know, the United States has projected influence in the Pacific and then subsequently in the Indian Ocean as well. So what we're now looking at is a scenario in which the United States, China, and India are important players, key players, pivotal players in the Indo-Pacific region. And what we're also looking at is shifting balance of power between these three players. I like the way in which you set up your presentation, the fact that CPEC builds on some tropes that we've now been hearing for a while, sort of building on the trope of mutual benefit, win-win diplomacy. That's something that is quite commonplace in the Chinese diplomatic lexicon and arguably has been since the 1950s, since Bandung. I also like the fact that Pakistan has seen CPEC as an opportunity to go back to its age-old obsession with building connectivity infrastructure, which is based upon this notion that if you have connectivity infrastructure, then many of your economic shortcomings can be overcome through that. And these are, once again, ideas that have been iterated since at least the 1960s. I sort of have three broad sets of comments, which I'll just share with you, and you can respond to them at this point, or perhaps we can open up the floor and take some questions, and you can engage with them a little bit later. One is this whole sort of relationship between China and India, which today, of course, makes it appear as if these two states are at loggerheads. But I'm also struck by the fact that when Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang took charge, Li Keqiang, who's the premier of China, his first international visit was to India. And this was May 2013. And when he was in India, he penned an editorial which appeared in the Hindu. And it was called A Handshake Across the Himalayas. And in the Handshake Across the Himalayas, Li Keqiang talked about how India and China were these two great Asian civilizations which were destined to work together and cooperate with each other. Then a couple of years back, when India changed the status of Kashmir and Pakistan was up in arms over that and expecting support from China, the Chinese ambassador to India, I think it was Sun Weidong, who used to be the ambassador here in Pakistan, he likewise had a piece in the Hindu in which he once again talked about the civilizational commonality between India and China, mentioned Xuanzang traveling across the ancient Silk Roads, once again suggesting that somewhere in the Chinese imagination there is going to come a time, or there should come a time, when these two states can overcome their hostilities and work closely together. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because if I play that out in my mind, then a part of me starts to wonder, well, where does Pakistan fit in all of this? And it might be that in the grand scheme, and once again, I'm saying something that's conjecture, I can't substantiate it empirically, but it might be that in the grand scheme, in the bigger framings, as far as China is concerned, it imagines itself having close relations with India at some point in the future, in which that becomes perhaps the most important relationship with a state in South Asia. So that was one point. The other point, which is something that I appreciated about your presentation and your paper, is that a lot of the benefits that BRI is supposed to provide in terms of the development of central China, the development of Western China, in terms of providing energy security, these are all ideas that we've been hearing iterated since the Cold War. So I'm struck by the fact that as such, these ideas have now been circulated since at least the 1990s. It was also at this point in time when the Chinese first started talking about building energy pipelines from Central Asia as well, and exactly the same argument was being given, that this way we can have some of our energy coming into the country bypassing the Straits of Malacca. And it might then very well be that the key strategic ideas have remained largely similar, or they're drawn from a similar pool, but what we're looking at is a new branding of those ideas, which then makes me think, and you implied this in your presentation as well, and this is something that now scholars are pointing to as well, that perhaps there will come a time when we won't be talking about BRI so much anymore, and these ideas might get framed as something else. So the larger concerns stay the same, but perhaps BRI becomes less central as far as the discourse is concerned. Finally, I sort of want to acknowledge and appreciate something that you talked about, I think a little more directly in the paper, and I suspect you were rushing at the end of your presentation, but you've got that sort of at the very end of your slide over here, which is where you're talking about Pakistan needs to take a position of ambivalence. And I think over here you have a real contribution to the policy discourse in this country. And that comes across very nicely in the draft version of the paper. And here I actually have a question. And my question is that is it not becoming Pakistan to take a position of ambivalence given things like Chinese governance in state peripheries such as Hong Kong and Xinjiang, given an increasingly forceful posture that China is taking vis-a-vis Taiwan, given what you also described in your presentation as increasing rivalry between China and the United States. China's been a good friend to Pakistan. Pakistan's also been a good friend to China, at least on issues of human rights, on issues of governance and administration in Xinjiang. And clearly Pakistan is taking a side. So I think what you're proposing over here, namely the fact that a position of ambivalence should be what Pakistan takes as its policy position. Perhaps the question is, has that stage not already passed? Has Pakistan not already taken a side? Given its position on Chinese governance and administration in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the sort of reaffirmation of China's right to adopt a particular stance in the Taiwan Straits. But thank you very much.
Okay. Shall I respond?
We can, or we can open it up. I mean, you can actually respond. Sure.
As I suppose China is India's largest trading partner as a single country. Southeast Asia as a region is bigger, okay? So China and India, while they have troops staring at each other, while they make some barbed comments about different postures which they have taken place on various issues, quite happily doing business. Sure, India is putting pressure on China by harassing various Chinese companies, banning certain Chinese apps. Seems like actually it's falling in line with something which the United States is calling its allies to do. So it's on one hand, it's kind of currying favor with the US, and on the other hand, it's being a little bit muscular itself, but it's not crossing a certain threshold that China and India's economic relations suddenly go into some kind of freezer or they stop trading. Both sides would be massively affected, so they won't do that. China is important, India is important, but I think in Chinese imagination, their main still concern is the United States. But I think what's happening in Central Asia is also, and I'll give you one example, is that they are also creating a footprint where they don't have a footprint where India had. And they want to create facts on the ground before they might decide to coming back to talk to India. And so one example I wanted to give was that the Taliban government has been complaining about Chinese investments in Afghanistan, and the Chinese are very happy to pay out for all these contracts, etc., and do nothing. And the Taliban government is saying, well, all they're doing is actually stopping Indians companies getting the contracts and investing. And so it's about trying to protect their economic footprint. And they're trying to create facts on the ground, because then if they do change relationships, rather than being what you call being submerged by the Indian economy, they will already have kind of what you call a footprint which will help them in that sense. So I think there is something going on in that sense. And at some point, there is what you call, what they call, there would be a shift, put it like that. And it kind of links up to the second thing, because these are old ideas. They're all old ideas about Central Asia, about what you call doing various kinds of development, reviving the Silk Road. There's nothing new about that in that sense. But what has actually changed is Russia. And I haven't really said anything about Russia about it, but it's quite important in this sense. And it goes back to 1990 when what you call the Americans started bombing, NATO bombed Serbia. And then the Iraq War and the arrival of American bases in Central Asia immediately after that. And that actually has created a kind of convergence between Russia and China. And one of the issues that, I think the main stumbling block for any of these ideas to take off in the past has been the resistance from Russia. And there has been a shift. And I think that BRI and allowing Chinese investment to take place, leaving it within the security sphere of Russia, is the kind of compact that they have arrived at. And that was an uneasy relationship until recently, because Russia was ambivalent that half of it was looking at the West and the other half was looking the East. But with the Ukraine war, the Western option has disappeared. Okay? And so I think, and so in that sense, this ambivalence, because there is an agreement that both agree that they want a multipolar world. They don't want a unipolar world. And there is also the same principal agreement with India. India also wants a multipolar world, not a unipolar world. The only question is, at what stage do they move from simply making these kinds of gestures to actually turning it into substance? And so I think that at some point in the future, if the geopolitics is not straightforward in that sense, but at some point there is a potential where they would say, we can make concessions, we can do work together with India because we can benefit, but they would like to do it when it favors them. And so they want to create kind of reality on the ground. Ambivalence. Yeah, we have, but I think the thing is that Pakistan's, what United States wants and what China wants are two different things. You want to keep United States off your back, you need to talk about terrorism, you need to talk about narcotics, you need to talk about security issues, which are nuclearization. These kind of issues are in their mind. And as long as they are what you call feel comfortable that Pakistan, Biden made once comment, Pakistan is a nuclear power and is joining China in this authoritarian bloc. That is something which will alarm them. But if Pakistan is talking to them on these important issues, and at the same time not necessarily following everything which the West says about Taiwan, democracy or whatever, but still taking Chinese money, there is a pathway there. It's a narrow pathway, but they can manage that and put it like that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Question was, tell me if I was wrong, I thought that what you said about the dirty industries, would it mean that
Sorry?
the dirty industries which China is exporting to us, would that mean that the pollution will be ours and the money will be Chinese?
Yes, the short answer. Look, they have signed up. They have signed up to the Paris Agreement. They have signed up to meeting certain environmental targets. They have signed up and they have deep concerns about their own environmental issues. People are dying from the pollution, which is enormous in Beijing and in these industrial areas. And so on one hand, they have these targets, but what are they going to do with these state-owned industries producing these primary products, dirty products, in the meanwhile, while they're saying, in the future, you need to up your game and be somewhere else. And so this is that space. We just send it around the world. You say, oh, you want a power plant? Yeah, oh great, I'll have a power plant. Oh, it's dirty, doesn't matter. We don't have any power, we live with that.
So Ahmad doesn't get off the hook, basically.
Well, we don't get off the hook, but but this is the point about agency. This is the point about agency. If you are going to say, what is the politics of this, or is there a security thing I can take about it, then you're not going to say, well, this is a dirty power plant and I don't want it. You're not going to say the price is not right. You're going to say, oh, I can make political capital out of it and I don't care the cost. I mean, that's the issue.
And that's also an important point that came across in the presentation, and it's there in the paper as well. The fact that many of these projects are actually contoured by the leadership and the people in power. Absolutely. Dr. Faz, and any other? Okay, G and Dr. Chitna. So we can maybe take these two questions together.
So thank you. Very interesting presentation. Very interesting comments. The last point that Hassan picked up, about Pakistan's foreign policy and dividends. So I was trying to think about history of Pakistan's foreign policy, and I don't think Pakistan was ever, for example, a non-aligned member. That was more India's forte.
But it was one of the organizers of Bandung.
But a temporary phase perhaps. So dividends has never been Pakistan's forte. Maybe for a small state like Pakistan, perhaps in terms of capacity, capability, it's not even possible. For Pakistan to really play out that part. That is what maybe you should comment on it. Since you've been studying CPEC, I wanted to ask that, in all these 8-9 years, is there a favorite domestic actor that Chinese? Is there a favorite domestic actor that Chinese like to interact with? If they are big on efficiency, service delivery, getting the job done, this theater that is playing in Pakistan, how are they reacting to this?
Okay.
You allow me one more. Because you both mentioned this, and I've heard you say that before also, that comment about the Chinese invoking the great civilizational sort of mutual factor between India and China. So then it got me thinking that US and China have a rivalry, but they also do business with each other.
Yeah.
India, China have a rivalry, they also do business with each other. India, Pakistan have a rivalry.
No business.
But is this very peculiar to China? Because US, Soviet Union, they had a rivalry, and when I use the word rivalry, I'm using it in an IR security studies literature kind of a sense. Well-established conflict dyads, this is what this literature talks about. So is this a very China peculiar behavior that you have this rivalry which signifies sustained long-term conflict, not always militarized, but hostility is there, number of conflictual sources of disputes are there, but very happy to do business also. This is quite remarkable. If you look at it from a security studies, realism-related sense, is this a very peculiar to China behavior, or do other powers engage in this?
And should we take Dr. Chitna's point, and then you can maybe respond. Ajit.
As we both mentioned, we mentioned quite a broad picture from international forces to Asia or Pakistani power, but I'm just wondering, as a historian, not theoretically, what's your empirical base? Where this data really come from, apart from newspaper? Because in CPEC, they don't release any documents really, so it's quite is a gray area. And when we're seeing all these ones, so where this all come from for your analysis or all this, one thing that. And if even you went for, let's say, Gwadar, another area for empirical study, so what was basically, I can't see anything, what was the impact of all these things on local community? Let's say for Baloch or Gwadar, there must be uprooting, or land levy, livelihood levy, so I think that's patterns of where they fit here.
Okay, sure. Ambivalence, and I think the thing is that Pakistan's, if you look at Pakistan's foreign policy for the last 75 years, it's jumped into bed at various points with the United States, in formal alliances and then informal alliances, and use that as a strategy to reap financial benefit. Our whole economic strategy basically is dependent on big handouts from wealthy patrons, and they were the patrons who we curried. And I think we need to move away, because our thinking has always been, India is big and we need to, how we're going to deal with that, let's find a counter-hegemon to India. I think the thing is, now we need to think about it in a different way, and that yes, you need to talk to everybody, and at the same time you need to keep a certain distance. You need to take what you want and what you call, what you don't want, you don't take it on those terms. So I think the idea is to move away. I mean, even now, we talk about China and United States as one or the other. It's not really. We talk about Saudi Arabia, but we don't even talk about Iran, our neighbor. And we treat everything as one or the other. What we need to be saying is, because one of the things I wrote in the paper is, in international economics, they say trade with your largest neighbor, the largest economy nearest to you, and you need to trade with your neighbors. We don't do any of those things, all right? And that requires us to start saying, well, actually, yeah, all right, somehow we got to figure out how can we talk to Iran and Saudi Arabia, how we can talk to India and other countries. We can't just simply take this position, one and not the other. That's the point about ambivalence. Do the Chinese have a favorite? Oh yeah. Shahbaz, they like Shahbaz's speed. They're definitely into that. They were very upset with Imran Khan, and he upset them when on his first visit. And Bajwa was called to Beijing and got rapped on his knuckles by President Xi, and he came back and told Imran Saab that this is not the way to do things. So they do have preferences in the sense that they want things to get done. They are not interested in our legal democratic pretensions. I won't say that they are facts, but we have these pretensions. They want things to be done authoritarianly. That somebody just simply signs off and says, right, I'll build a road and I'll demolish all this village and I'll evict all these people and I don't care whether they have any legal rights or not. Then, that's the way they think. And so, in that sense, Shahbaz is the action man, and they did prefer him. But as I said, they have become cooled about BRI simply because they put a lot of money out there and they now seem to lose all of this. Globalization. Yeah, but look, you see, in classical neo-realistic IR, we talk about the state. And we talk about what you call state power. We talk about a Hobbesian jungle. We talk about how you can coerce your fellow states into doing what you want, and you talk about hegemonic strategies. But the other end of IR is talking about globalization. And they're saying that these boundaries have become so meaningless with these global supply chains that have been generated. And since the 1990s, when China opened up and joined the WTO, it created a huge dynamic in the global economy, integrating China with the United States, China with the Pacific Rim, China with the European Union and Europe. And so, what we are seeing also is the other side of IR theory is about the global economy. And so now the Americans have a problem. Is that how we can actually put pressure on China without harming ourselves? And so they say, oh yes, we'll put a chip ban. You can't buy high-end chips. And American companies are petrified. They say, well, I mean, that's our business model. It's just evaporated. Well, who are we going to sell it to? I'm still waiting for the Chinese retaliation. You know, think about what they call those rare earth alloys. Rare earth alloys which only the Chinese produce and are used in their F-35 fighters. They had to give a special exemption on the F-35 that there is I've forgotten the rare earth metal they use as a magnet which actually makes the plane operable, and it only comes from China. And so this is about interconnection. And so both sides can pressurize. So the question is, you know, they are standing up to each other, they are muscling each other, but nobody is saying, you know, we're going to cut trade. I mean, that's like saying Hollywood is going to go bust, Telsa is going to go bust, because their biggest markets are China. And so this is where that connection, what the Americans want to do is to discipline China. You are a naughty boy. We're going to make you do what we want to do. That's what they would ideally like to do. Whether they can do it, that's a real problem. Sources? Yeah, I mean, I can understand the sources. There are government documentation, okay? Now, government documentation, there's now a substantial secondary literature out there, but I use a lot of interviews with government personnel. You know, sit down, have a chat, and they'll tell you things off the record, this happened, that happened, and that's quite revealing. And it's always, you know, I mean, that's the only way that you're going to, what you call, find interest, information about what's happening behind the scenes, and etc. Otherwise, if you read the newspaper, oh yeah, the world is rosy and we are in paradise and there's no crisis.
Basically, press releases. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Samad. Really enjoyed this, and it's a very important discussion. And I hope that there will be opportunities to continue having conversations on China and Pakistan, China and Asia. I think this is extremely timely. Thank you to the audience. Very grateful for you all.